The first thing Eva Thatcher noticed that morning was not the sunrise breaking gold over the Wyoming ridge, nor the rooster crowing off toward the Hendricks place 2 miles east. It was the silence where a familiar creak should have been, the absence of that awful grinding whine her broken gate always gave when the wind pushed it against its splintered post. She stood barefoot on her porch in her nightdress, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, staring down the muddy path toward the fence line, and she could not make sense of what she saw. The gate stood straight, whole, mended. Eva Thatcher had lived on this quarter section of land 3 miles outside the town of Larkspur, Wyoming Territory, for 6 years, and for the last 2 of those years she had lived on it alone. Her husband Daniel had died in the spring of 1876, thrown from a Greenbroke gelding while chasing a stray heifer through a hailstorm. And since that day, the gate at the edge of her property had been one small, constant reminder of everything she could not keep up with by herself. The top hinge had rusted through the previous autumn. She had meant to fix it a dozen times. She had even bought new hinge pins from the mercantile in town, wrapped in brown paper and tucked in a drawer, waiting for a day when her hands were not so tired and her heart not so heavy. Now the gate hung true on new leather hinges, the post reset deep and packed with fresh earth, the crossbar sanded smooth where splinters used to catch her palms. She walked down the porch steps in her bare feet, heedless of the cold mud soaking between her toes, and knelt beside the post to run her fingers over the work. It was good work, careful work, the kind of work a man did when he was not in a hurry and did not expect thanks. That was when she saw the boot prints. They pressed deep into the soft mud beside the fence, distinct and heavy, the prints of a working man's boot with a worn heel that favored the outside edge just slightly, as though the man who wore them carried himself with a faint limp, or perhaps simply leaned into his labor, the way men did who had spent years bent over fence posts and branding irons. The prints led from the gate toward the tree line at the edge of her property, toward the trail that ran along Willow Creek and eventually joined the road to the Callaway spread, and beyond that to the Rocking Bee Ranch, where she knew several drovers had been hired on for the spring gather. Eva Thatcher pressed her hand against her mouth, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she smiled so wide it nearly hurt. She did not know who had done it. She had her suspicions, but nothing certain. What she knew was that someone had come to her land before the sun rose, in the cold and the mud, and had fixed something broken without asking for a single word of gratitude, without leaving so much as a note, without wanting anything at all in return. In a world that had taken so much from her, that small, quiet kindness felt like the first warm thing she had touched in 2 years. She stood at that gate a long while, watching the mist burn off the fields, and something in her chest that had gone still and cold for a very long time gave the faintest, most hesitant flutter. Calvin Whitaker did not consider himself a sentimental man, though the other hands on the Rocking Bee might have argued otherwise if they had seen him slip out of the bunkhouse 2 hours before dawn with a coil of leather straps and a sack of tools slung over his shoulder. He was 29 years old, lean and sun-worn, with hands calloused from a decade of rope burn and branding smoke, and he had ridden into Larkspur 3 months prior with little more than his horse, his saddle, and a reputation for being good with cattle and better with a hammer than most men twice his age. He had taken work with Silas Boone at the Rocking Bee because the pay was fair, and the man did not ask too many questions about where a drifter had come from or why. He never seemed to stay anywhere long. The truth was, Calvin Whitaker had been staying places a long time now without ever quite settling. He had grown up in Missouri before the war tore through it, had lost his father to a fever and his older brother to a Confederate bullet at Pea Ridge, and had drifted west with his mother until she, too, passed from consumption when he was 19. Since then he had worked cattle from Texas to the Dakotas, always moving, always telling himself the next town would be different, though he had never quite believed it. Larkspur might have stayed just another stopping point if not for the woman he had seen 3 weeks earlier at the mercantile, arguing quietly but firmly with the store owner about the price of nails, her chin lifted with a pride that told Calvin plainly she would rather go without than be pitied. He had learned her name from the men at the ranch before he ever spoke a word to her himself. Eva Thatcher, widow, ran her own homestead. Wouldn't sell to Calloway no matter how many times he came calling with his fine coat and his talk of a fair price. Calvin had ridden past her place more than once since then, driving cattle along the creek trail, and each time he noticed the same things. The sagging roofline on her barn that needed new shingles before the next hard rain, the fence posts leaning like old men after a long walk, and the gate, the poor broken gate, hanging crooked on its rusted hinge, groaning every time the wind pushed against it as though the whole homestead were crying out for a hand that never came. He had asked around, careful not to seem too interested, and learned she had no brothers, no father living, no sons, nothing but her own 2 hands and whatever daylight she could spare between tending her small herd of cattle and the vegetable garden that fed her through the winter. Jed Calloway, who owned the largest spread in the county and controlled the water rights on Willow Creek upstream of her land, had been pressing her to sell for the better part of a year, and everyone in Larkspur knew it, though nobody quite said aloud what everyone suspected, that Calloway wanted more than her land. He wanted her too, and he did not much care which he got first so long as he got both eventually. Calvin Whitaker did not know Eva Thatcher. He had never spoken more than a tip of his hat to her in passing. But something about a woman standing alone against a man like Calloway, refusing to bend even when the whole territory seemed determined to bend her, settled deep in his chest and would not let him rest. So on a cold morning in early April of 1878, before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, Calvin Whitaker rode out from the Rocking Bee bunkhouse, tied his horse a quarter-mile off so as not to wake her with the sound of hooves, and walked the rest of the way on foot carrying his tools. He worked in the gray half-light with his coat collar turned up against the chill, and when the gate hung straight and true at last, he stood back and looked at it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done something right, even if no one would ever know it was him. He walked back to his horse before the rooster crowed, and he told himself that was the end of it. A kindness done, a debt to nobody paid. He did not expect to think of her again. He was wrong about that, though it would take him a few more mornings to admit it. Eva did not tell anyone about the gate at first, not even Sarah Byen, the schoolteacher who had become her closest friend in Larkspur since Daniel's death. She kept the small mystery close to her chest like a secret she was not ready to share, turning it over in her mind while she milked her one remaining cow, while she hoed the rows of new potato plants, while she sat by lamplight mending a torn shirt that had once belonged to her husband, and that she could not bring herself to throw away. It was 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, that she found the second kindness. She woke to discover the loose board on her porch step, the one that had wobbled underfoot for a year, nailed down flush and solid. And beside it in the dust, the same boot prints, the same worn heel favoring the outside edge. She stood on that step with her coffee cooling in her hands and felt something she had not felt in a long time, curiosity that was not tinged with grief. She wanted to know who this was. She wanted to see his face. She decided without much deliberation that she would find out. The following night Eva did not go to bed at her usual hour. Instead, she sat in the rocking chair by her front window with a quilt over her knees and a lamp turned low, watching the dark yard beyond her porch, waiting. She dozed twice despite herself, jerking awake each time with a start, annoyed at her own tiredness, but she was determined to see this mysterious visitor with her own eyes. It was nearly 4 in the morning when she heard it, the soft crunch of boots on the frost-hardened path, careful and slow, a man trying not to make noise. Eva's heart began to hammer. She rose from the chair, wrapped the quilt tighter around her shoulders and crept to the door, easing it open just enough to see. There, in the thin silver light of a waning moon, was a man crouched beside her chicken coop, running his hands along a section of wire fencing that had come loose from its post, the very fencing that had let a fox take 2 of her hens the week before. He worked quietly, methodically, his hat pulled low, and even in the dim light Eva could see the breadth of his shoulders, the steadiness of his hands. She stepped out onto the porch, and the old board beneath her foot, the one he had not yet fixed on this side of the house, creaked loud as a gunshot in the silent yard. The man went still as a startled deer. Then slowly he stood and turned toward her, and Eva found herself looking into the face of a stranger she had seen only once before, in passing, outside the mercantile. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough with embarrassment, "I did not mean to wake you." "You did not," Eva said, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she wondered if he could hear it from where he stood. "I was already up. I have been waiting for you, actually, though I confess I did not expect to catch you tonight." He had the grace to look ashamed, ducking his head and turning his hat over once in his hands. "I suppose I ought to explain myself." "I suppose you ought," Eva agreed, though there was no anger in her voice, only a kind of wondering amusement that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. "You fixed my gate." "Yes, ma'am." "And my porch step." "Yes, ma'am." "And now my chicken wire." "I noticed the fox tracks," he said, as though that explained everything, as though a man simply noticing fox tracks near a stranger's henhouse was reason enough to rise before dawn 3 days running, and mend her property piece by piece without ever once asking to be thanked. Eva pulled the quilt tighter and stepped down off the porch, closing the distance between them until she stood only a few feet away. In the moonlight she could see he was younger than she had first thought, though there was a weathering to his face, a tiredness around his eyes, that spoke of hard years. He was handsome in a plain, honest sort of way, the kind of handsome that did not announce itself but crept up on a person slowly. "What is your name?" she asked. "Calvin Whitaker, ma'am. I work over at the Rocking Bee for Mr. Boone." "Eva Thatcher," she said, though she suspected he already knew that. "Why have you been doing this, Mr. Whitaker? You do not know me. We have never even spoken until tonight." Calvin was quiet a moment, looking down at his hat, and when he answered his voice was careful, as though he had considered the question many times before and still had not settled on the right way to say it. "I ride past your place most every week, driving cattle down to the creek," he said. "I have seen the way you work this land alone, Mrs. Thatcher, and I have seen the things that need mending that you cannot always get to on your own, not with the cattle and the garden and everything else you carry. It did not seem right to me, a person struggling so, when I had 2 good hands and an hour to spare before sunup. I did not do it to be thanked. I truly did not mean for you to catch me at all." Eva studied his face in the moonlight, searching for some sign of the calculation she had come to expect from men in this territory, the same calculation she saw in Jed Calloway's eyes every time he rode up her drive with his too friendly smile and his talk of a fair price for her land. She found none of it in Calvin Whitaker. What she found instead was something like shyness, an earnestness that seemed almost foreign to her after 2 years of fending off men who wanted something from her, whether it was her land or her hand, or simply the satisfaction of seeing a widow bend to their will. "Well," she said finally, "I thank you anyway, Mr. Whitaker, whether you meant for it or not. It has been a long time since anyone did something kind for me without wanting something back." "I do not want anything back, ma'am," Calvin said quickly, and there was something almost fierce in the way he said it, as though the very suggestion offended him. "I only wanted to help." Eva smiled then, the same wide smile she had worn 3 mornings before at the sight of her mended gate, and in the moonlight Calvin Whitaker thought he had never seen anything so lovely as a tired, grieving woman finding a reason to smile again. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Whitaker?" she asked. "It is cold, and you have been working half the night on my behalf. The least I can do is offer you something warm before you ride back." Calvin hesitated, glancing toward the eastern sky where the first hint of gray was beginning to soften the darkness. "I ought to get back before Mr. Boone notices I am gone, ma'am." "Another time, then," Eva said, and she was surprised at how much she meant it, how much she hoped there would be another time. "Another time," Calvin agreed, and he settled his hat back on his head and gave her a small nod before turning to walk back toward the tree line where his horse waited. Eva stood on her porch and watched him go, watched the shape of him fade into the gray morning light, and she found she was still smiling long after he had disappeared from sight. Word of the mysterious mending done at the Thatcher place did not stay secret long in a town the size of Larkspur, where gossip traveled faster than the weekly stagecoach. It was Sarah Byan who brought it up first, cornering Eva after Sunday service outside the small clapboard church, her eyes bright with curiosity. "They say someone has been fixing up your place at all hours," Sarah said, looping her arm through Eva's as they walked toward the wagons. "Mrs. Prout says her husband saw a rider heading toward your land before dawn more than once. Do you know who it is?" Eva felt her cheeks warm, though she kept her voice light. "I have an idea. Eva Thatcher." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face her friend directly, her expression somewhere between delight and disbelief. "You cannot simply say that and walk away. Who is it?" "His name is Calvin Whitaker. He works for Mr. Boone at the Rocking Bee." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "The new drover. The quiet one who keeps to himself." "I would not know how quiet he keeps himself, since we have only spoken the once," Eva said, though even as she said it she felt a small thrill at the memory of that moonlit conversation, the careful, honest way Calvin Whitaker had explained himself. "Well," Sarah said, looping her arm through Eva's once more and starting them walking again, "whoever he is, it sounds to me like a man worth getting to know a little better. It has been 2 years, Eva. Daniel would not want you closing your heart off forever." Eva did not answer right away. The mention of Daniel still brought a familiar ache, though it had softened over time into something more like a bruise than an open wound. She had loved her husband fiercely, had grieved him the same way, and for a long while she had believed that part of her life was simply finished, that she would spend the rest of her days working her small piece of land alone and calling it enough. "I do not know what I want, Sarah," she admitted quietly, "but I know that when I think of him I do not feel afraid. That is more than I can say for how I feel when Jed Calloway comes calling. Calloway came by again this week, Thursday. He brought a jar of honey from his sister's bees and spent 20 minutes telling me how much easier my life would be if I simply sold him the north pasture and moved into town." Eva's mouth tightened at the memory. "As though I have not spent 6 years proving up this claim with my own hands, as though Daniel did not die trying to keep this land whole." "He wants more than the pasture," Sarah said gently. "Everyone in town knows it." "I know it too," Eva said. "It does not make me want to give it to him any more than I already did not want to." They reached the wagons, and Sarah squeezed Eva's arm before letting go. "Well, I hope your Mr. Whitaker keeps fixing your gates and your porch steps and whatever else needs mending. Sounds to me like the kind of man this territory could use more of." Eva laughed, a real laugh, the first in longer than she cared to count, and rode home that afternoon with her heart lighter than it had been in 2 years. Calvin did not come again for nearly a week after their moonlit meeting, though not for lack of wanting to. Silas Boone had put the outfit to work culling the winter wheat cattle and moving the main herd toward the higher summer pasture, and Calvin found himself in the saddle from before dawn until well after dark most days, too exhausted most nights to do more than fall into his bunk and sleep like the dead. But he thought of her. He thought of Eva Thatcher's smile in the moonlight more than he cared to admit, thought of the way she had stood in the cold in nothing but a nightdress and a quilt, unafraid, meeting his eyes directly instead of looking away the way so many women did when a strange man appeared in their yard before dawn. He thought about the steadiness in her voice, the pride that had not curdled into bitterness despite everything the territory and her own grief had thrown at her. It was Silas Boone himself who gave Calvin the opening he needed, sending him into Larkspur on a Saturday to collect supplies, and a new plow blade that had been ordered from the mercantile weeks before. Calvin took his time about the errand, telling himself it was only practical to check on the mending he had done, to see whether the gate still held, whether the chicken wire had kept the fox at bay. He told himself a great many things that Saturday morning that were not entirely true. He found Eva in her garden, kneeling in the dirt between rows of new corn shoots, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows and a smear of soil across one cheek. She looked up at the sound of his horse and, seeing him, rose to her feet and wiped her hands on her apron, and Calvin thought again, as he had the first night he saw her at the mercantile, that there was something about the set of her shoulders, some quiet strength in the way she carried herself, that he had not seen in any other woman he had known. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, and there was warmth in her voice that eased the nervousness sitting in his chest. "I did not expect to see you in daylight." "I had business in town," Calvin said, dismounting and leading his horse to the hitching post beside her fence, the fence he himself had mended not 2 weeks before. "Thought I would stop by and see how the gate was holding." "The gate is holding just fine," Eva said, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth, "as is the porch step, and the chicken wire, though I have not seen hide nor hair of that fox since." "Good," Calvin said, and then, because he did not quite know what else to say, he added, "Good, that is good." Eva laughed softly at his obvious discomfort, and the sound of it, warm and unguarded, seemed to loosen something in Calvin's chest. "Would you like to come in for coffee, Mr. Whitaker? I promised you some the last time, and it seems only fair to make good on it now that the sun is up, and you cannot use the excuse of hurrying back before Mr. Boone notices." "I would like that very much, Mrs. Thatcher," Calvin said, and he meant it more than he had meant anything in a long while. They sat at her small kitchen table, the same table Daniel had built with his own hands the summer before they married, and Eva poured coffee into 2 chipped tin cups while Calvin looked around at the small, tidy house, noting the care with which everything had been arranged despite the evident poverty of the place. A single shelf held a handful of books, well worn. A patchwork quilt lay folded over the back of a rocking chair by the window. Everything spoke of a woman who took pride in what little she had, who refused to let hardship make her careless. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Whitaker," Eva said, settling into the chair across from him. "I know you work for Silas Boone and that you have a gift for mending fences before the sun is even up, but I confess I know little else." Calvin turned his cup slowly between his hands, considering where to begin. "Not much to tell, ma'am. I was born in Missouri before the war. Lost my father when I was young, my brother in the fighting, and my mother a few years after that. Been working cattle ever since, moving from one outfit to the next. Never had much reason to stay anywhere long." "That sounds lonely," Eva said, and there was no pity in her voice, only understanding. "I suppose it has been," Calvin admitted, "though I never thought much on it until lately." "What changed?" Calvin looked up and met her eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The morning light slanted through the small window and fell across the table between them, and Calvin Whitaker, who had spent a decade telling himself that a drifting man had no business wanting to put down roots, felt something shift quietly inside his chest. "I think you know what changed, Mrs. Thatcher," he said finally, his voice low. Eva's cheeks colored, but she did not look away. "Please," she said softly, "call me Eva." "Eva," Calvin repeated, and the name felt right in his mouth, felt like something he had been waiting a long time to say. "Then you must call me Calvin." "Calvin," Eva said, and she smiled, and Calvin Whitaker thought he would ride out from the rocking bee every morning for the rest of his life if it meant seeing that smile again. The weeks that followed were, for both of them, unlike anything either had experienced before. Calvin found reasons to ride past the Thatcher homestead whenever his work allowed, sometimes stopping only long enough to exchange a few words over the fence, sometimes staying long enough to share a meal or help with some task that needed 2 sets of hands. He mended the sagging barn roof over the course of several Saturday afternoons, climbing up with shingles borrowed against his wages, while Eva handed tools up from below, and teased him about the way he hummed old trail songs under his breath while he worked. He taught her, one warm evening in May, how to properly throw a lariat, standing behind her with his hands over hers to guide the motion. And though the lesson ended with more laughter than roped fence posts, something had passed between them in that closeness, a warmth neither was quite ready to name aloud. Eva, for her part, found herself looking forward to each visit with an eagerness that both delighted and unsettled her. She had not expected to feel this way again, had believed some part of her heart had closed for good when Daniel died, and yet here she was, catching herself smiling at nothing in particular while she worked in her garden, simply because she was thinking of the way Calvin Whitaker's eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed. She told Sarah Bryan everything, sitting on the schoolteacher's porch one evening while the sun set gold over the prairie. "He asked me to the Founders' Day dance," Eva said, unable to keep the smile from her voice. "Next Saturday in town. And what did you tell him?" "I told him yes." Eva looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "Sarah, is it foolish of me? It has only been 2 years since Daniel. What will people say?" "People will say what people always say," Sarah replied, reaching over to squeeze Eva's hand. "But Eva, I have not seen you this happy since before Daniel passed. Do not let the gossip steal that from you. You have grieved. You have honored his memory. There is no shame in finding joy again." Eva nodded slowly, though the worry did not entirely leave her. There was, after all, more standing between her and happiness than simple gossip, and both women knew it. "What about Calloway?" Sarah asked, as though reading her thoughts. "Does he know about Calvin?" "Not yet," Eva said, "but Larkspur is small. He will know soon enough. And when he does—" Eva's jaw tightened, the same set to her shoulders that had carried her through 6 years of hard homesteading and 2 years of grief. "Then he will know that I have made my choice, and it was never going to be him." Jed Calloway learned of Calvin Whitaker's visits to the Thatcher homestead exactly 1 week before the Founders' Day dance, delivered to him by one of his own ranch hands who had seen Calvin's horse tied outside Eva's fence on more than one occasion. Calloway received the news the way he received most inconveniences in his life, with a tightening around his eyes and a cold, calculating silence that his men had learned to fear more than any shouted anger. Jed Calloway was 43 years old, a man who had built the largest cattle operation in the county through a combination of hard work, ruthless business dealings, and a willingness to use his control over the water rights along Willow Creek to pressure smaller ranchers into selling their land at whatever price he named. He had first set his sights on Eva Thatcher's homestead not long after Daniel's death, recognizing both the value of the land itself, which controlled a crucial stretch of the creek downstream from his own property, and the opportunity presented by a young, attractive widow with no family to protect her interests. He had told himself in the beginning that his interest in Eva was purely business. Over the months, however, watching her refuse his offers with that same unbending pride, he had found himself wanting her for reasons that went beyond the water rights, though he would never have admitted this even to himself in so many words. He wanted to be the one to break that pride. He wanted to see her bend. The news that some drifting cowboy from the Rocking Bee had been calling on her, mending her fences and apparently winning her affection in the process, struck Calloway as both an insult and an obstacle that needed removing. He rode to the Thatcher homestead the following afternoon, dressed in his finest coat, carrying with him a small velvet box that he had been saving for the right moment, believing, in his arrogance, that the moment had finally arrived, and that a formal proposal of marriage, backed by the promise of a comfortable life free from the endless labor of homesteading, would surely be enough to sway her. Eva was hanging wash on the line when he arrived, and she felt her stomach tighten at the sound of his horse approaching. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that his visits might taper off on their own, but Jed Calloway was not a man accustomed to giving up on anything he wanted. "Mrs. Thatcher," he said, dismounting with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own welcome. "You look well." "Mr. Calloway," Eva replied, keeping her voice civil but cool. I am in the middle of my washing. I am afraid I do not have much time to visit today. This will not take long, Calloway said, and something in his tone made Eva's hands still on the wet linen she held. He reached into his coat and produced the small velvet box, opening it to reveal a gold ring set with a modest diamond. Eva, I have admired you for a long time. I believe you know my intentions where your land is concerned, but I want you to understand that my feelings go beyond mere business. I am asking you to marry me. Eva stared at the ring, then at the man holding it, and felt a wave of something between disbelief and anger rise in her chest. Mr. Calloway, she said carefully, I have told you many times that I have no intention of selling my land. I must tell you now just as plainly that I have no intention of marrying you either. Calloway's face hardened, the pleasant mask slipping just enough to reveal the coldness beneath. This is about that drifter, is it? The cowboy from Boone's outfit. This is about my own wishes, which have nothing to do with you or any decision I might make regarding my heart, Eva said, drawing herself up to her full height. I would ask you not to come here again, Mr. Calloway, unless it is on legitimate business. You are making a mistake, Calloway said, his voice low and hard now, all pretense of courtship abandoned. That land of yours sits downstream of my water rights, Mrs. Thatcher. I control what flows through Willow Creek before it ever reaches your fields. A woman in your position would be wise to consider who her friends are. Eva felt a chill run through her despite the warm spring afternoon, but she did not let it show on her face. Are you threatening me, Mr. Calloway? I am simply pointing out a fact of geography, Calloway said, closing the velvet box and returning it to his coat pocket. But I will say this. I have been patient with you, Mrs. Thatcher, out of respect for your husband's memory. That patience has limits. And I do not take kindly to being made a fool of in front of the whole county by a drifter who will not be here come winter. He mounted his horse and rode off without another word, leaving Eva standing among her hanging laundry with her heart pounding and a cold knot of fear settling in her stomach. She had faced down Calloway's advances before, but never had he spoken so openly of using the water rights against her. She knew, as every rancher in the county knew, that a dry summer combined with an unfriendly upstream neighbor could mean the difference between a herd that survived and one that did not. That evening, when Calvin arrived for their usual visit, Eva told him everything, her voice tight with the effort of keeping her fear contained. Calvin listened in silence, his jaw tightening more with each word, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening fields. He cannot simply cut off the water, Calvin said finally. There are rights filed, are there not? Water law in this territory follows the doctrine of prior appropriation, and I have heard your husband filed his claim on the creek the same year he proved up this homestead. He did, Eva said. But filing a claim and defending it are two different things when the man upstream controls the headgates and has more money and more men than I could ever hope to match. Then we will need proof, Calvin said, his mind already working through the problem the way he might work through a difficult stretch of trail. Records at the land office in Cheyenne. Witnesses who can speak to how long the water has flowed to your fields without interruption. If Calloway tries to cut you off, he will be breaking the law, and the law can be made to matter if enough people are willing to stand behind you. And if he does not care about the law, Eva asked quietly. Men like Calloway have a way of making trouble disappear before it ever reaches a judge. Calvin reached across the small distance between them and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping gently around hers. Then he will have to go through me first, Eva. I mean that. Eva looked at him in the fading light, at the fierce protectiveness in his eyes, and felt something in her chest swell with a feeling she had not let herself name until that moment. Calvin, she said softly, I do not want you putting yourself in danger on my account. It would not be only on your account, Calvin said, his voice rough with emotion. Eva, I have been drifting from one outfit to the next for 10 years, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. I did not know what I was looking for until I found myself riding past your gate every week, finding reasons to stop, finding reasons to stay a little longer each time. I love you, Eva Thatcher. I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it because I want anything from you. I say it because it is true, and because I could not bear to see harm come to you when I have it in my power to stand beside you instead. Eva felt tears prick at her eyes, though they were not tears of sorrow. I love you too, Calvin, she said, the words coming easier than she had expected, as though she had been holding them ready for some time without quite realizing it. I did not think I would ever say that to another man after Daniel, but you have shown me, these past weeks, that my heart was not as closed as I believed. Calvin drew her into his arms then, and Eva went willingly, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling for the first time in 2 years that she was not facing the world entirely alone. The Founders' Day dance took place the following Saturday in the town hall of Larkspur, a long wooden building, usually used for church socials and the occasional traveling preacher's revival, but which had been transformed for the evening with strings of paper lanterns and tables laden with pies and roasted meats brought by every family in the county. A fiddler and a man with a guitar had set up in the corner, and by the time Calvin arrived to collect Eva from her homestead in the borrowed buggy Sela's Boone had lent him for the occasion, the sound of music and laughter could already be heard drifting across the prairie. Eva wore her best dress, a deep blue calico that had belonged to her mother, and had pinned her hair up with more care than she had taken in longer than she could remember. When Calvin saw her step out onto the porch, he found himself momentarily unable to speak, struck by how lovely she looked in the golden evening light. "You look beautiful, Eva," he managed finally, helping her up into the buggy. "You do not look so bad yourself, Calvin Whitaker," Eva teased, taking in his clean shirt and the way he had slicked back his hair for the occasion. The dance itself passed in a blur of music and laughter for both of them. Calvin was not a natural dancer, and he stepped on Eva's feet more than once during the reels, but she only laughed and pulled him back into step, and by the third dance, he had found his rhythm well enough that they moved together with an ease that drew more than a few knowing smiles from the older women watching along the edges of the hall. It was during a quiet moment, when the fiddler paused to rest, and the dancers had drifted outside to cool themselves in the evening air, that Jed Calloway made his presence known. He approached them near the punch table dressed in his finest suit, his expression carefully composed into something like polite civility, though Eva could see the tension beneath it. "Mrs. Thatcher," Calloway said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Whitaker, I trust you are enjoying the evening." "We are, thank you," Eva said carefully, feeling Calvin's hand settle protectively at the small of her back. "I wonder, Mr. Whitaker," Calloway continued, his tone light but with an edge beneath it that made Calvin's jaw tighten, "whether you have given much thought to your prospects here in Larkspur. A drifting cattle hand does not typically have much to offer a woman of Mrs. Thatcher's standing. Land security, a name that means something in this county. I would hate to see her waste her affections on a man who will move on with the next cattle drive." "I have no intention of moving on, Mr. Calloway," Calvin said evenly, though there was steel beneath the calm of his voice. "And I would ask that you not speak of Mrs. Thatcher's affections as though they were yours to comment on." "Calvin," Eva said softly, a warning and a plea both in his name. Calloway's smile thinned. "I only mean to look out for the lady's interests. I have known her far longer than you have, Mr. Whitaker, and I have far more to offer than a bunkhouse bed and a drifter's wages." "What you have to offer, Mr. Calloway," Eva said, stepping forward with her chin lifted in the same proud way that had first caught Calvin's attention weeks before, "is a controlling hand over water that rightfully flows to my land as well, and threats disguised as concern. I will not pretend I do not know what you are doing. Calvin Whitaker has shown me more genuine kindness in 3 months than you have in 2 years of calling on me, and I would thank you to remember that my heart, like my land, is not for sale." The small crowd that had gathered nearby, drawn by the tension in the air, murmured quietly at this, and Calloway's face flushed with anger and embarrassment at being so plainly rebuffed in front of half the town. "You will regret this, Mrs. Thatcher," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only Eva and Calvin could hear it. "Both of you will." He turned and stalked away into the night, and Eva let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Are you all right?" Calvin asked, turning to look at her with concern. "I am," Eva said, though her hands were trembling slightly. "I only hope his threats are empty ones." They would not have long to wait to find out. The dry spell that had settled over the county through the early summer of 1878 was not unusual for Wyoming Territory, but it was severe enough that even the older ranchers spoke of it with concern, remembering droughts from years past that had wiped out entire herds. Eva's small herd of cattle depended on the flow of Willow Creek through her property, a flow that had, until that summer, always been reliable enough to sustain her modest operation even in dry years, thanks to the water rights her husband had filed years before. It was in the second week of July that Eva first noticed the creek running lower than it should have, the water level dropping day by day until the once steady stream had thinned to little more than a trickle threading through cracked mud banks. She rode the length of her property in growing alarm, and when she reached the boundary line shared with Calloway's spread, she found what she had feared. The headgate that controlled the flow from the main channel of Willow Creek had been closed, diverting nearly the entire flow of water into a series of irrigation ditches that fed Calloway's own fields, leaving only a trickle to continue downstream to Eva's land. She rode straight to the rocking bee, finding Calvin in the corral working with a young horse, and the look on her face told him something was badly wrong before she even spoke. "He has cut off the water," Eva said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger and fear. "Calloway has closed the headgate. My cattle will not survive the summer without it, Calvin, and neither will my garden." Calvin's expression darkened. "That is a clear violation of your water rights, Eva. Your husband filed his claim years before Calloway expanded his own operation. This is illegal, plain and simple." "Illegal or not, the water is not flowing," Eva said. "What good does a filed claim do me if my cattle die of thirst before a judge ever hears the case?" Calvin set down the rope he had been holding and crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "We will go to the land office in Cheyenne ourselves if we have to. We will find your husband's original filing. We will gather statements from every rancher downstream who has relied on that water flowing freely for years. Calloway may have money, Eva, but the law is on your side here, and I will not let him steal what is rightfully yours through nothing but greed and spite." "Cheyenne is 2 days' ride," Eva said. "By the time we return with any kind of ruling, my herd could already be lost." Calvin was quiet a moment, thinking. "Then we do not wait for the law alone. Tonight I will ride out to that headgate myself and open it back up. It is your legal right to that water, Eva. I am not asking permission, I am simply going to see it done. And if Calloway wants to make an issue of it, he can explain to a judge why he closed a lawfully filed water right in the first place. Calvin, if you go alone and his men catch you there could be violence. I could not bear it if something happened to you because of me." "Nothing is going to happen to me," Calvin said gently, though the set of his jaw told her his mind was made up. "But I am not going alone. I intend to speak with Silas Boone first. His own herd depends on that creek flow as much as yours does, further downstream, and I doubt he will take kindly to Calloway hoarding water that belongs to more than just his own operation." Silas Boone, as it turned out, needed little convincing. He had suspected for some time that Calloway's water usage was excessive, and when Calvin explained what had happened at the Thatcher homestead, the older rancher's face darkened with an anger that matched Calvin's own. "That headgate serves half a dozen operations downstream of Calloway's place," Boone said, pulling on his coat and calling for his foreman to saddle horses. "He has no right closing it off entirely, water rights or no. I will ride out there myself, and I will bring every hand I have got. Calloway wants to start a fight over water in a dry summer. He is going to find out real quick that he is not the only man in this county with something to lose. That evening, a party of nearly a dozen riders, led by Silas Boone and Calvin Whitaker, rode out to the boundary between the Rocking Bee and Calloway's spread, where the headgate sat closed and silent against the thin trickle of water struggling to pass beneath it. Calloway himself arrived within the hour, alerted by one of his own men, accompanied by 4 ranch hands who eyed the assembled group with evident unease at being so badly outnumbered. "This is my land, Boone," Calloway said, his voice tight with fury as he took in the sight of so many riders gathered at his boundary line. "You have no right coming out here armed, threatening." "Nobody is threatening anything, Calloway," Silas Boone cut in, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who had built his ranch through hard work and fair dealing over 30 years in the territory. "You closed off a headgate that serves water rights filed and recorded years before you ever expanded your own irrigation. Daniel Thatcher filed his claim on this creek in 1872. My own operation has drawn from this same flow since 1870. You do not get to decide, on your own authority, that your fields matter more than ours." "That widow cannot even work her land properly," Calloway spat. "She would be better served selling out and letting someone competent manage it." "That is not your decision to make," Calvin said, walking his horse forward until he sat directly across from Calloway, close enough that the other man could see the barely controlled anger in his eyes. "Eva Thatcher has proved up that claim with her own hands for 6 years, through more hardship than most men in this county have ever faced, and she has done it without stealing water that does not belong to her. You will open that headgate tonight, Calloway, and you will let it run as it always has, or Mr. Boone and every other rancher standing here will see to it that the Territorial Land Office hears about this before the week is out, and you can explain to a judge why you thought you were above the law." For a long moment, Calloway said nothing, his eyes moving over the assembled riders, calculating the odds and finding them badly against him. Whatever satisfaction he might have taken in tormenting Eva Thatcher was not worth the ruin that would follow a formal complaint to the territorial authorities, not with half the ranching community of the county standing arrayed against him. "Open it," he said finally, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage, gesturing to one of his own men. "Let the water run, but mark me, this is not finished." "It is finished, Calloway," Silas Boone said flatly. "You have made your play and you have lost. I would suggest you find some other way to occupy your time from now on, one that does not involve threatening widows or stealing water that is not yours to take." The headgate creaked open, and the men gathered there watched in the fading evening light as the creek began to swell once more, the water rushing forward to reclaim its rightful channel, flowing on toward the fields and cattle and gardens of every homestead downstream that depended on its steady passage. Calvin rode back to Eva's homestead that same night to tell her what had happened, finding her waiting anxiously on her porch, unable to sleep for worry over what might have occurred at the boundary line. "It is done," Calvin said, dismounting and crossing to her in the moonlight. "The water is flowing again, Eva." Calloway backed down once he saw he was outnumbered and out of legal ground to stand on. "I do not believe he will trouble you again, not with Silas Boone and half the ranchers in the county now watching him closely." Eva threw her arms around Calvin's neck, and he held her close, feeling the tension of the evening slowly drain from both of them. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for standing with me, Calvin. I do not know what I would have done without you these past months." "You would have found a way," Calvin said, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. "You are the strongest woman I have ever known, Eva Thatcher. But I am glad, more glad than I can say, that you do not have to do it alone anymore." Eva reached up and touched his face gently. "I do not want to do it alone anymore, Calvin. I want you beside me for as long as you will have me." "Eva," Calvin said, his voice thick with emotion, "I intend to be beside you for the rest of my life if you will let me." He reached into his coat pocket then, and Eva's breath caught as she watched him produce a small ring, simple and unadorned, fashioned from a thin band of gold that Calvin had purchased with nearly a month's wages from a jeweler in Cheyenne during a supply run weeks before, carrying it with him ever since, waiting for the right moment. "Eva Thatcher," Calvin said, dropping to one knee in the mud beside the very gate he had mended that first dawn so many weeks before. "I have spent 10 years drifting from place to place, never finding a reason to stay. I found that reason in you. I love you more than I have words to say, and I want to spend the rest of my life mending fences beside you, watching this land grow, building a home together. Will you marry me?" Eva felt tears spilling down her cheeks, tears of joy this time, unmixed with any sorrow. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with happiness. "Yes, Calvin, I will marry you." Calvin rose and slid the ring onto her finger, and then he kissed her there beneath the stars, beside the gate that had brought them together. And Eva Thatcher felt, for the first time since Daniel's death, that her heart was whole again, not because the grief of the past had disappeared, but because she had found room within it for a new and different kind of love, one that honored what had come before while building something entirely her own. They were married 3 weeks later, on a warm August afternoon, in the same small church where Eva had first confided her feelings to Sarah Bryan. Half the county turned out for the wedding, drawn by the story that had spread through Larkspur in the weeks since the confrontation at Callaway's Headgate, a story of a drifting cowboy who had fixed a widow's gate before dawn, and in doing so, had found himself a home and a wife. Sarah Bryan stood as Eva's attendant, weeping openly with happiness through the entire ceremony, while Silas Boone, looking uncharacteristically formal in a pressed suit, stood as Calvin's best man, having come to think of the younger cowboy almost as a son in the months since he had hired him on. Jed Callaway did not attend the wedding, having quietly begun making arrangements to sell off a portion of his herd and reduce his operations following the public humiliation of the confrontation at the Headgate, his reputation in the county considerably diminished by the incident. He would trouble Eva and Calvin no further in the years that followed, eventually selling his ranch altogether and moving east, a fact that neither Eva nor Calvin spent much time thinking about once their own lives had settled into the rhythm of a marriage built on genuine love and mutual respect. Calvin moved his few belongings from the Rocking Bee bunkhouse to Eva's homestead the day after the wedding, and together they set about building a life that neither had quite dared to imagine for themselves before they met. Calvin's skill with cattle and his tireless work ethic, combined with Eva's fierce determination and knowledge of the land she had worked for 6 years, transformed the small homestead from a struggling operation, barely surviving, into a thriving small ranch within just a few years. They expanded the herd gradually, careful never to overextend themselves the way so many ranchers in the territory did during the boom years, building instead on a foundation of patience and hard work. Calvin built a new barn to replace the sagging one he had first repaired as a courting gift, and together they added a second room onto the house, and then a third, as their family began to grow. Their first child, a son they named Daniel after Eva's first husband, a gesture that moved Calvin deeply when Eva suggested it, was born in the spring of 1879, less than a year after their wedding. Calvin held the boy in his arms on the very porch where he had first spoken to Eva in the moonlight, and he wept unashamedly at the sight of his son's small face, thinking of how far he had come from the drifting, rootless man who had ridden into Larkspur with nothing but a horse and a saddle. A daughter followed 2 years later, whom they named Sarah after Eva's dear friend, who by then had married the town's new doctor and settled permanently in Larkspur herself. 2 more children followed in the years after that, a boy named Silas after the man who had stood beside them against Callaway, and finally another daughter, whom they named simply Grace, for that was what Eva said she felt every single morning she woke beside her husband on the land they had built together. The gate at the edge of the property, the very one Calvin had mended that first cold dawn so many years before, remained standing long after that first hinge had needed replacing again, long after the boot prints that had once marked the mud beside it had washed away in a dozen seasons of rain. Eva never forgot the morning she had found it whole, never forgot the wondering joy of tracing a stranger's footsteps toward a mystery that had led her, in the end, to the great and unexpected love of the second half of her life. On quiet evenings, when the children had been put to bed and the ranch had settled into the peaceful stillness of a Wyoming night, Eva and Calvin would often sit together on the porch, watching the stars emerge over the prairie, and Eva would sometimes reach for her husband's hand and say, without any need for further explanation, "I still remember the boot prints in the mud." And Calvin, every time, would smile the same shy smile he had worn that first moonlit night, and he would say, "I am glad you did not wash them away before I got the chance to introduce myself properly." They lived on that land together for the rest of their days, through good years and lean ones, through the slow transformation of the territory into statehood, through the raising of 4 children who grew up strong and capable on the same soil their mother had once worked alone. The homestead that had once been a source of struggle and grief for a young widow became, under their joined hands, a place of genuine happiness, a home built not on the calculation of land and water rights that had driven a man like Jed Calloway, but on the simple, quiet kindness of a cowboy who had risen before dawn to fix a broken gate for a woman he had not yet even met, asking for nothing in return but the chance to ease her burden in whatever small way he could. Eva Thatcher, who became Eva Whitaker on that warm August day in 1878, often told her children, and later her grandchildren, the story of how their father had won her heart not with grand gestures or fine words, but with hammer and nails and quiet, patient labor performed in the cold hours before sunrise, when he believed no one would ever know it was him. It was, she always said, the truest measure of a man's character, what he was willing to do for another person when he expected nothing in return. And in Calvin Whitaker she had found a man whose character never wavered, not in all the years they spent together, not through hardship or joy, not until the very end of their long and happy lives, when they were laid to rest beside one another on a small rise overlooking the land they had built together. The mended gate still standing at the edge of the property, a quiet monument to the love that had begun with a single act of kindness on a cold Wyoming morning.